The iron gate of the kennel yard shrieked open, and every dog within 50 yards went silent. Naomi, just 12 years old, felt Master Calloway's hand lock around her thin wrist like a manacle as he pulled her toward the runs where the hunting hounds lived. Their eyes glowed like scattered coals in the Louisiana twilight. With the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to children in moments of crisis, she knew she was about to be thrown to the dogs for something she hadn't done. The missing silver had actually been stolen by the master's own wasteful son. Louder than her hammering heart was the low, rumbling growl from the largest kennel at the far end. That was where they kept the dog nobody dared approach. A massive bloodhound named Brutus, who had already mauled 2 overseers and was scheduled to be shot at week's end. As Calloway shoved her stumbling toward that very kennel, as the other enslaved workers watched in horror from the cotton house and the barns, as her mother screamed from somewhere she couldn't see, Naomi understood she had perhaps 5 minutes left to live. Unless something impossible happened. Unless the monster in that kennel decided, for reasons no one could predict or explain, that a terrified girl was worth protecting instead of tearing apart. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how Naomi ended up in that kennel yard with death breathing down her neck, you need to understand the Calloway plantation in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, in the summer of 1897. And you need to understand the particular brand of cruelty that festered there like an infected wound that wouldn't heal. Before we continue with this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment freedom so I know who you are. Thank you. And now, let's get back to the story. The Calloway place sat on 800 acres of rich bottom land along Bayou Teche, where the water ran dark as coffee and twice as bitter. The main house was a sprawling monstrosity of white columns and pretension, built by Nathaniel Calloway's grandfather back when cotton was king and human suffering was the currency that bought Southern prosperity. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks like the beards of ancient prophets, and the air itself felt thick with secrets and sins that had soaked into the soil over generations. Nathaniel Calloway himself was 43, with a face like a hatchet blade and eyes that held all the warmth of a January frost. He'd inherited the plantation at 25 when his father had the good sense to die of apoplexy during an argument about crop prices. He'd been running it into the ground ever since, through a combination of vicious management and spectacular incompetence. Yields dropped every year, debts mounted, and Calloway's response was always the same: work the people harder, feed them less, squeeze every drop of profit from human misery until nothing was left but bone and desperation. He had a wife named Charlotte, who spent most of her time in New Orleans pretending her husband didn't exist. She'd take the train down once a month, stay at her sister's house in the Garden District, and return only when the money ran low and she needed to extract more from Nathaniel's dwindling accounts. They had one child together, a son named Richard, who at 17 had already developed his father's taste for cruelty without any of the restraint that came from actually having to manage a working plantation. Richard Calloway was the kind of young man who pulled wings off flies as a child and graduated to bigger prey as he got older. He rode through the quarters at night shooting at shadows. He set fire to the chapel the enslaved workers had built just to watch it burn. He took particular pleasure in tormenting the young girls who worked in the big house, finding excuses to have them punished for infractions real or imagined. The overseers looked the other way because Richard was the boss's son and because some of them shared his appetites. The enslaved workers learned to make themselves invisible when Richard was around, to move like ghosts through the house, to never meet his eyes or speak unless spoken to. Naomi had been working in that house for 6 months, since her 12th birthday. Assigned to polish silver and sweep floors and make herself invisible, the most important skill any enslaved person could develop in proximity to the Calloways. She was small for her age, all sharp angles and knobby joints, with skin the color of pecan wood and eyes that saw too much. Her hair was kept wrapped tight in a cloth, her dress was patched calico that had been worn by 3 other girls before her, and her hands were already developing the calluses of constant work. Her mother, Celia, worked in the laundry house, standing over boiling kettles of water and lie 12 hours a day until her hands cracked and bled. Her father had been sold away to Texas 3 years prior, when Calloway needed quick cash to pay a gambling debt. Naomi remembered him only in fragments now, the sound of his laugh, the way he used to carve little animals out of wood scraps, the song he sang while working that made the day pass easier. She had 2 younger brothers, Samuel, who was 8, and Joshua, who was 6, both already working in the fields when they weren't being rented out to neighboring plantations during harvest season. The family lived in a cabin at the edge of the quarters, one room with a dirt floor and a fireplace that smoked when the wind came from the east. They shared the space with another family, the Washingtons, separated only by a curtain made from old flour sacks. Privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Safety was something they dreamed about but never expected. Naomi had learned early to keep her head down, to move quietly, to never make eye contact with either Calloway man. She'd learned which floorboards in the big house creaked and which were silent. She'd learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken. She'd learned to make herself so unremarkable, so forgettable, that she could move through rooms like smoke. But on August 14, 1897, keeping her head down hadn't been enough. She'd been in the dining room that morning, polishing the silver service that Charlotte Calloway had inherited from her mother. The set included a tea service, candlesticks, serving platters, and various utensils, all needing to be polished weekly whether they'd been used or not. It was tedious work that made her fingers ache and her nose burn from the Polish fumes. But it was better than field work. Better than the laundry house, where her mother's hands were being slowly destroyed by caustic soap and scalding water. Richard had come in around 10 o'clock, reeking of whiskey though it wasn't yet noon. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt was untucked, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone trying very hard not to appear drunk. He'd watched her work for a few minutes with the kind of attention that made her skin crawl, that made her want to run. But running was impossible. Running was suicide. So she'd kept polishing, kept her eyes down, kept breathing as quietly as possible. Richard had stumbled forward, knocking against the sideboard hard enough to rattle the china. He'd cursed, righted himself, then pulled open one of the drawers. She'd heard him rummaging through the contents, heard the clink of metal against wood. Then he'd left, weaving toward the stairs to sleep off his drunk, and Naomi had continued her work and thought nothing more of it. She'd learned not to pay attention to the Calloway's private business, learned that seeing too much or knowing too much was dangerous. But that evening, when Nathaniel Calloway had gone to the sideboard to pour himself a drink before supper, he discovered that his father's silver flask was missing. A piece worth perhaps $30 but priceless in sentimental value. It was engraved with the Calloway family crest and had been carried by his father during the war. Calloway treasured it more than most of his human property. He'd called for Naomi immediately. His voice boomed through the house. "Get that girl in here now." She'd come running, her heart already sinking because she knew that being summoned was never good. That the big house was a place of constant danger where your life could change in an instant based on nothing more than the whim of angry white men. She'd stood in that dining room with her hands shaking while Calloway loomed over her, demanding to know where the flask was. She'd said she didn't know, which was the truth. She'd said she'd been alone in the room, which was also true. But she'd made the fatal mistake of hesitating before answering, trying to decide whether mentioning Richard's presence would make things better or worse. Whether telling the truth would protect her or doom her. Because everyone on the plantation knew that accusing a white person of anything, even if true, especially if true, was grounds for severe punishment or death. The truth didn't matter in a place like this. Power mattered. And Naomi had none. Calloway had seen that hesitation and interpreted it as guilt. His face had gone red, then purple. A vein had started throbbing in his temple the way it did when he was working himself up to violence. "You calling my son a thief?" he'd said, his voice dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that came before explosions. "No, sir," Naomi had whispered, but the denial came too late. The hesitation had already convicted her. Calloway had grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises that would last for weeks. He dragged her out of the house, down the porch steps, across the yard, while enslaved people scattered out of his path like birds before a storm. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone had seen this before. The kennels, the dogs, the screaming. The kennel sat on the eastern edge of the property, a series of long, low buildings and outdoor runs where Calloway kept his hunting dogs. He was famous across 3 parishes for his hounds, particularly his bloodhounds, which he bred and trained for tracking runaway slaves. The business of returning human property to their owners was lucrative, and Calloway took pride in his dog's success rate. He charged $50 per retrieval, more if the runaway had been gone for more than a week. His dogs could track a scent trail 3 days old through swamp and forest, could distinguish one person's smell from another's, could run for hours without tiring. He kept 15 hounds total, housed in individual runs with chain-link fences and concrete floors. The dogs were fed well, better than the enslaved workers in some cases, because they were valuable assets. Each one represented an investment of money and training time. But the prize of his collection was a massive male bloodhound he'd paid $200 for at auction in New Orleans, a dog with a legendary nose and an equally legendary temperament. The dog's name was Brutus, and he'd been trained from puppyhood to track human scent, to follow trails days old through swamp and forest, to never give up once he'd locked onto a target. He was brilliant at his job, utterly relentless, with a success rate that made him worth his weight in gold. But he was also unpredictable and violent in ways that made him dangerous even to the people who worked with him. He'd attacked his first handler when the man had tried to take away his food bowl, breaking the man's arm in 3 places. The bones had healed crooked, and the handler couldn't do heavy work anymore, so Calloway had sold him down river to a sugar plantation, where damaged goods went to die slow. He'd mauled the second handler so badly the man lost the use of his left hand, 3 fingers torn off at the root, the thumb mangled beyond repair. That man had been reassigned to lighter duties, his value diminished, his future prospects destroyed. The current kennel master, a wiry man named Pike, kept Brutus isolated in the largest run at the far end of the compound. He fed him by dropping raw meat through a slot in the fence and never opened that gate unless the dog was muzzled and chained, and even then, only when absolutely necessary. Pike had been working with dogs for 20 years, had handled every kind of temperament from gun-shy to aggressive, but Brutus scared him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just the violence, it was the intelligence behind it, the calculation, the sense that Brutus was always thinking, always waiting for an opening. Calloway had been planning to have the dog destroyed. The violence was becoming a liability, and several neighboring plantation owners had suggested that maybe Brutus was more trouble than he was worth. But Calloway kept putting it off because Brutus was simply too valuable, too good at his primary function, to kill just yet. The dog had brought back 17 runaways in the past 2 years. 17 people who'd risked everything for freedom and been dragged back in chains because of Brutus's nose. That represented $850 in retrieval fees. You didn't kill an asset that profitable. As Calloway dragged Naomi across the yard toward the kennels, she understood with sickening clarity what he intended. He was going to throw her in with Brutus. It was his favorite punishment for serious infractions, a way to terrorize without actually killing, though sometimes the dogs did kill. And then Calloway would shrug and say the slave shouldn't have stolen or run or talked back, whatever excuse he needed to justify the death. The other dogs would bark and snap, but they were trained to respond to commands. They'd frighten but rarely attack. But Brutus was different. Naomi's mother, Celia, had appeared from somewhere screaming, "Please, master, please," she didn't take nothing. "Please, don't." But one of the overseers, a thick-necked man named Dutch, had grabbed Celia and held her back, his hand over her mouth to muffle her cries. And Calloway had ignored her completely, as if she were no more significant than a bird crying in the trees, as if her anguish was just background noise to be tuned out. Pike, the kennel master, stood by the gate to Brutus's run, his face carefully neutral. He knew better than to interfere with Calloway's punishments, knew that objecting would just get him beaten or sold. But his hands were shaking slightly as he worked the heavy lock, a padlock that required 2 keys, one that Pike wore around his neck and another that Calloway kept on his person. That's how dangerous Brutus was. Double-locked like a prisoner in a maximum security facility. The other dogs had gone silent, sensing the tension, all except Brutus, who had started a low, continuous growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. A sound that came from deep in his chest, primal and threatening. A sound that said he knew something was happening and he was ready for it. Naomi could see him now through the chain-link fence, a massive dog, easily 140 pounds, with a broad head, loose jowls that hung like curtains, and eyes that held a rage she recognized because she'd felt it herself every day of her life on this plantation. Brutus's coat was dark brown with black markings, his ears long and pendulous, his body thick with muscle built from constant pacing and occasional violent outbursts. Scars marked his muzzle where chains had rubbed, where he'd thrown himself against fences, where he'd fought and won and lost and survived. Calloway shoved her forward, and she fell sprawling in the dirt, her hands scraping against gravel sharp enough to draw blood. Pike opened the gate. The hinges screamed like something dying. "Get in," Calloway said. His voice was calm now, almost pleasant, the way it got when he was enjoying himself. Naomi looked up at him, then at the dog, then back at Calloway. "Please," she whispered. The word came out broken. "I said get in." He wasn't shouting anymore, didn't need to. The threat was clear. The other enslaved workers had gathered at a distance, close enough to witness, not close enough to be blamed for watching. Close enough to see what happened when you were accused of stealing. Close enough to learn the lesson Calloway wanted them to learn. Her mother was sobbing, the sound muffled by Dutch's hand but still audible. An old man named Abraham had his hat pressed to his chest like he was already at her funeral. A woman named Ruth had turned away, unable to watch. But most stood frozen, bearing witness, because that's all they could do. Naomi climbed to her feet, her legs barely supporting her weight. She took one step toward the gate, then another. Each step felt like walking through deep water, like her body was moving against her will. Then she was inside, and Pike slammed the gate shut behind her, the lock clicking into place with a sound like a coffin closing. The finality of it made her knees weak. Brutus stood 30 feet away, his head lowered, his shoulders bunched. The growl built in his chest like distant thunder, building and building until it filled the air, filled her head, filled the space between heartbeats. His eyes were locked on her, unblinking, measuring, calculating. Naomi pressed her back against the fence, her breath coming in short gasps that sounded like sobs. Her hands found the chain link behind her and gripped it tight enough to hurt. The metal bit into her palms, but she didn't let go. It was the only solid thing in a world that had gone liquid with terror. The dog took a step toward her, then another. His lips had pulled back from his teeth, yellowed fangs made for tearing flesh from bone, teeth that had ripped through leather and wood and human skin. His head swung low, nose working, pulling in her scent, the scent of fear and sweat and the lavender soap she'd used that morning in the big house. Naomi squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the attack, waiting for the pain, waiting for those jaws to close around her throat or her arm or her leg. She thought about her mother, about her brothers, about her father somewhere in Texas who would never know what happened to her, about all the things she'd never do, never see, never become. But the attack didn't come. Instead, she heard a different sound, a whine, high and confused, like the dog couldn't make sense of what he was experiencing. She opened her eyes. Brutus had stopped 10 feet away, his head tilted slightly. The growl had faded to something that sounded almost like uncertainty. His ears, which had been pinned back against his skull, had come forward slightly. His tail, which had been rigid, had relaxed a fraction. They stared at each other, girl and dog, and something passed between them. Something that had no name in any language humans spoke. Something older than words, a recognition of shared circumstances, of being caged and threatened and used, of having violence done to them and expected of them, of being trapped in systems they didn't create and couldn't escape. Brutus took another step forward, but slowly this time, cautiously, like he was approaching something fragile that might break. His nose stretched toward her, nostrils flaring as he pulled in her scent more deeply. Not the quick assessment of prey, but something longer, more considered. He was reading her. Reading her fear, yes, but also reading something else, something beneath the fear. Naomi held her breath. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with her back pressed against the fence and watched this massive creature approach her with something that looked almost like curiosity instead of rage. The dog came closer, closer, until his massive head was inches from her face, close enough that she could feel his breath hot against her cheek, could smell the blood and meat on his breath from his morning feeding, could see the scars on his muzzle up close, the places where skin had been torn and healed, the places where chains had rubbed fur away, the evidence of all the violence that had been done to him in the name of making him useful. Then, impossibly gently, he pressed his head against her shoulder and made a sound that was almost a whimper, a sound of loneliness, of recognition, of finding something unexpected. Naomi's hand came up without her conscious decision, moving on pure instinct, the way you might reach out to steady yourself when falling, and rested on the dog's head. Her fingers found the space between his ears, the warm, soft fur there, the solid reality of skull beneath. Brutus leaned into the touch, the way a dog leans into affection, the way a creature starved for gentleness responds when gentleness is finally offered. His eyes closed halfway. His breathing deepened. The last remnants of that growl faded into silence. Behind her, outside the fence, she could hear confused muttering. Calloway's voice rising. "What the hell is happening?" Pike's quieter response. "I don't know, sir. I've never seen him do that. Never." But Naomi wasn't listening to them. She was focused entirely on this moment, on this impossible connection, on the fact that this creature everyone feared had chosen not to hurt her, had chosen instead something that looked almost like comfort, almost like companionship. She stayed there, frozen in that position for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, her hand on Brutus's head. The dog's weight pressed against her, both of them breathing in sync, both of them existing in this small pocket of peace that shouldn't have been possible in a place like this. Finally, Calloway's voice cut through the silence. "Get her out." The words were clipped, angry, but also uncertain. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't the lesson he'd intended to teach. Pike fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking more now than before. He swung the gate open and gestured urgently for Naomi to come out. She moved slowly, carefully, her hand sliding away from Brutus's head. The dog watched her go with eyes that held something that might have been confusion or might have been recognition, might have been the beginning of understanding that there was someone in this place who saw him as something other than a weapon or a threat. Naomi stumbled out of the kennel. Calloway grabbed her arm again, his fingers digging into the same bruises he'd made earlier. His face was red with rage and something else, something that looked like fear or maybe humiliation. "You got lucky," he said, his voice tight with an emotion she couldn't identify. "Next time you won't be." He shoved her toward her mother, who caught her and held her trembling against her chest. Celia's hands ran over Naomi's body, checking for wounds, checking for blood, checking that her daughter was still whole and breathing and alive. "Thank God," Celia whispered. "Thank God. Thank God. Thank God." But as Calloway stalked away, his boots kicking up dust, his shoulders rigid with frustrated violence, Pike the kennel master caught Naomi's eye and gave her the smallest nod. A gesture of acknowledgement, of recognition. He'd seen what happened. He didn't understand it any more than anyone else did, but he'd seen it. And Brutus stood at the fence, watching as she walked away. His eyes never left her until she disappeared around the corner of the laundry house, until she was out of sight, but not, somehow, out of mind. That night, Naomi lay on the pallet she shared with her brothers in the cabin that housed her family. Samuel and Joshua were already asleep, their small bodies pressed against her for warmth despite the August heat. Her mother sat by the fireplace even though no fire burned, staring at nothing. The Washington family on the other side of the flour sack curtain was quiet, pretending not to listen while listening to everything. Naomi couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying that moment when Brutus had pressed his head against her shoulder, when everything in his breeding and training should have made him attack, when the smart thing, the expected thing, would have been to tear her apart and prove once again that he was the monster everyone believed him to be. She'd grown up around dogs her whole life. The plantation had hunting hounds and farm dogs and strays that wandered through the quarters looking for scraps. She knew how to read their body language, knew when to approach and when to give space, knew the difference between a dog that was playing and a dog that was hunting. But she'd never experienced anything like what had happened in that kennel. It felt like recognition. Like Brutus had seen something in her that made him hesitate, had seen past the fear and the circumstances to something deeper, something essential. Or maybe, she thought, he'd seen himself, a creature trained to hunt and hurt and terrorize, but who'd found in that moment a choice, a chance to be something other than what people had made him. She thought about the scars she'd seen on his muzzle, the marks of chains and whips. Thought about the isolation he lived in, kept separate from every other living thing because he was too dangerous to risk. Thought about the violence he'd committed and the violence that had been committed against him. And she understood. Because that's what they were trying to do to all of them, separate and control and break, turn them into weapons against each other or into nothing at all, make them so afraid of each other that they couldn't unite, make them so desperate that they'd do anything, hurt anyone, just to survive one more day. But Brutus had chosen differently. In that moment when he could have killed her, when he was expected to kill her, when killing her would have been the path of least resistance, he'd chosen something else. He'd chosen connection. And maybe that mattered. Maybe that meant something. The next morning, Naomi woke before dawn, as always. She helped her mother prepare the thin cornmeal mush that served as breakfast. She got her brothers dressed and ready for their day in the fields. She walked to the big house as the sun was just beginning to burn off the night's fog, and she tried to focus on her work, on staying invisible, on surviving. But she couldn't stop thinking about the dog, about those dark eyes that had looked at her with something other than rage, about the weight of his head against her shoulder, about the choice he'd made. She found excuses to walk past the kennels, carrying laundry, fetching water, delivering messages that could have been delivered by anyone. Each time she looked, Brutus was at the fence of his run, watching, waiting, like he knew she'd come back, like he was hoping she would. Pike noticed. On the third day, he hailed her as she was passing by with an armload of linens. He glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then spoke quietly. "That dog," he said, "keeps looking for you. Been standing at that fence every morning since. Won't eat until he's watched the yard for an hour." Naomi didn't know what to say to that. She clutched the linens tighter, feeling the rough fabric against her arms. Pike continued. "I've been working with dogs 20 years. Never seen nothing like what happened. That dog's killed smaller prey, torn up 2 men bad. But he looked at you and just stopped." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Brutus was supposed to be shot. Calloway finally made the decision. But after what happened with you, he's holding off. Says he wants to see if the dog can be controlled after all. If maybe there's something there that can be used. Naomi felt something twist in her chest, a combination of relief and dread. Relief that Brutus wouldn't be killed, dread at what being useful might mean for him. Pike leaned in closer. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "you might want to come by the kennels early tomorrow, before anyone else is up. Bring something for him. Some scraps if you can find them. Let him see you again. Because if Calloway thinks the dog can be controlled, he's going to want to test it. And if the test goes wrong, Brutus dies. But if you can..." And something in her couldn't accept that. Couldn't let another living thing be destroyed just because it had been hurt too badly, had been pushed too far, had been made into something people feared. Because that's what they did to all of them eventually. That's what this place did. It took people and broke them and then punished them for being broken. Before dawn the next morning, while the quarters were still dark and silent, Naomi slipped out of the cabin. She'd saved a piece of cornbread from her supper, hiding it in her dress pocket. It wasn't much, wasn't the raw meat that Brutus was used to, but it was something. An offering. A gesture. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of the bayou. Fog hung low over the ground, turning the world into something ghostly and uncertain. She moved quietly, keeping to the shadows, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. Every sound seemed amplified: the distant call of an owl, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush, her own breathing. The kennels were dark. Pike had left a single lantern burning low near the gate, a signal that he'd kept his word, that the way was clear. Naomi approached Brutus's run slowly, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might wake the entire plantation. Brutus was awake. Of course he was. He stood at the fence, his massive head silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky beyond, waiting, like he'd known she would come. Naomi stopped a few feet from the fence. For a long moment they just looked at each other. Then she pulled out the cornbread and held it out. "I brought you something," she whispered. "Not much, but it's all I got." Brutus's nose twitched. He took a step toward the fence, then another. When he reached the chain link, he pressed his nose through one of the gaps, sniffing. Naomi moved closer, close enough to break off a piece of cornbread and push it through the fence. Brutus took it gently, his teeth barely grazing her fingers. He chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. Then he swallowed and pressed his nose through the fence again, not demanding more food, just touching, making contact, confirming that she was real. Naomi's hand came up and found the spot between his ears again, that same place she'd touched 3 days ago. And Brutus made that sound again, that soft whimper that didn't match his size or his reputation, that sound of loneliness finally finding company. They stayed like that until the sky began to lighten in the east, until Naomi knew she had to get back before her absence was noticed. "I'll come again tomorrow," she whispered. "If I can, I'll keep coming as long as they let me." Brutus watched her walk away, and she felt the weight of his gaze the entire distance back to the quarters. It became a routine over the following weeks. Every morning before dawn, Naomi would slip out and visit Brutus. She'd bring whatever scraps she could find, sometimes cornbread, sometimes a bit of fat trimmed from pork, once on a lucky day some chicken bones with meat still clinging to them. And each time Brutus would take the food gently and then press against the fence, asking for touch more than sustenance. Pike facilitated these visits, keeping watch and making sure no one saw. He never explained why he was taking this risk, why he was protecting a young enslaved girl's secret relationship with a dangerous dog. But Naomi suspected it was because Pike understood something about being trapped, about having your nature twisted and used, about wanting something better even when better seemed impossible. Word began to spread through the quarters, whispered conversations in the evening. That girl, Celia's daughter, the one Calloway threw to the monster dog. Dog didn't touch her. Dog acts gentle around her now. She visits him before dawn. Brings him food like he's a pet instead of a killer. Some people thought she was blessed, touched by something divine. Others thought she was foolish, courting danger that would eventually catch up to her. But most just watched and wondered and hoped that if impossible things could happen in a kennel, maybe they could happen elsewhere too. Calloway heard the rumors eventually. Everything that happened on a plantation reached the master's ears sooner or later. Someone always talked. Someone always traded information for favor or protection, or just because causing trouble was the only power they had. He showed up at the kennels one morning in late September. Naomi was already there, her hand through the fence, Brutus leaning into her touch. She heard the boots on gravel and turned to find Calloway standing 10 feet away, Pike beside him looking apologetic and frightened. "So," Calloway said, his voice deceptively calm, "I hear you've been visiting my dog. Making friends with him." Naomi pulled her hand back from the fence and dropped her eyes. "Yes, sir. I didn't mean no harm, sir. He seemed lonely." Calloway laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Lonely? You think that animal gets lonely? He's a dog, girl. A tool. A weapon. He doesn't have feelings." But even as he said it, Brutus had moved to the fence closest to Naomi. Positioned himself between her and Calloway, not aggressively, just protectively, making a statement with his body that his loyalty, such as it was, had shifted. Calloway saw it. His eyes narrowed. "Show me," he said. "Go in there. Let me see this magic you supposedly have." Naomi felt ice form in her stomach. This was a test, a trap, but refusing wasn't an option. Pike opened the gate, his hands shaking. Naomi walked in. Brutus immediately came to her, pressing his shoulder against her leg. She rested her hand on his head. Calloway's face went through several expressions: surprise, calculation, something that might have been grudging respect. "Well," he said finally, "seems you've done what 3 trained handlers couldn't. Made that monster manageable." He paused. There might be use in this. A dog that responds to commands could be worth keeping alive after all. He looked at Pike. "Don't shoot him. Not yet. Let's see if this arrangement can be developed into something profitable." Then he looked at Naomi. "You'll continue these visits every morning. You'll work with Pike to train the dog. Make him useful. If you succeed, you might just save both your lives. If you fail, well, we'll deal with that when it happens." He walked away, leaving Naomi standing in the kennel with a responsibility she never asked for and a connection she didn't fully understand. Over the following months, Naomi learned to work with Brutus in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. Pike taught her the basics of dog handling: how to use voice commands, how to reward good behavior, how to establish boundaries without violence. But what really worked was something simpler: trust, consistency, treating Brutus like a living being with thoughts and feelings instead of just a tool. The dog responded in ways that seemed almost miraculous to people who'd only known him as violent and unpredictable. He learned to sit and stay, to come when called, to walk calmly on a lead instead of lunging. He was still wary around men, still prone to aggression when he felt threatened. But with Naomi, he was gentle, patient,